Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, America. Whatever your time zone across this beautiful planet Earth of ours, you are tuned into the People Speak radio show this evening with Steve Johnson. The People Speak show normally airs every Tuesday, 6 to 7 p.m. Pacific and 9 to 10 p.m. Eastern on the BBS radio network. Anyone can participate during the show with call-in questions for our guests, toll-free in the USA and Canada on 1-888-429-5471. That number again, 1-888-429-5471. We have an amazing special guest on our show tonight. I'm more excited than ISIS getting their weekly CIA care package. It is a special guest, a professor of philosophy and religion and theology emeritus. He has published over 34 books, primarily in theology, philosophy, religion, with special emphasis on the problem of evil and the relation between science and religion. 7 of his books deal with 9/11, including the New Pearl Harbor, disturbing questions about the Bush administration, and of course the 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions. We are talking tonight to distinguished writer and researcher Professor David Ray Griffin about his new book called Unprecedented. Can civilization survive the CO2 crisis? And, of course, we're going to talk about the stooges that pulled off 9/11. Welcome, a big welcome to the People Speak radio show, Professor David Ray Griffin, sir.
Thank you, Steve. Good to talk to you.
Awesome to have you here, sir. We'll be taking audience questions after the first half hour, but my first question to you, Professor Griffin, sir, is what prompted you to write about global climate change in your new book?
Well, it's a concern I've had for a very long time, and I had written a book that I never quite finished and therefore didn't get it published about 10 years earlier about various problems, and I decided that the climate problem was the number one issue. But then I got sort of sidetracked on 9/11, and I thought it was something I could deal with rather quickly. And but the motivation there was in large part, thinking that if we don't get 9/11 exposed, then the world is going to be so focused on terrorism and war that we will never be able to devote sufficient time, energy, and money to the climate issue. And so that was a long detour because I ended up writing 10 books on that subject. And but now I've decided I really need to get back. I was giving some lectures in China. I've been asked to give some lectures on climate change, and that really motivated me to see, how the Chinese are thinking about this. And of course, it is the fact that China and America are the two crucial ones, and if we can cooperate, we might have a chance.
Yeah, in your new book called Unprecedented, you pull no punches. You go out after the ones who are really poisoning the planet. The big corporations will tell us that it's the people poisoning the planet, but really, at the end of the day, it is companies like ExxonMobil, it's companies like Monsanto, it's the major corporations that are earning the billions in profits that are really poisoning the earth. Would you not agree with that, sir?
Absolutely. The first, my book is divided into 3 sections. The first part deals with the various phenomena of climate change. Then the second part deals with the various problems, reasons we've had such many problems, media, politics, religious, and economics. But I started with climate denial. And the climate denial movement is huge, and it has been funded by the fossil fuel industry, and primarily ExxonMobil for a long time. Now it's the Kochs putting in even more money than the ExxonMobil. But ExxonMobil was the one that got the really movement started. They put in many, many millions of dollars into it. They funded climate denial groups all over the planet. And, America is the primary one where there's denialism, but it's all over. The biggest story just recently is about ExxonMobil. And maybe you dealt with this on your program already. But a big study came out a few weeks ago showing that ExxonMobil, where it had been spending millions of dollars and claiming that there was no, truth to global warming being caused by fossil fuels, and there's no danger from climate change, from fossil fuels. Exxon, back when it was just Exxon, they did lots of studies on it, and they realized, their scientists realized, that the fossil fuel industry had to change very radically, or they were probably going to change the planet so much it will not be reversible. Well, they did that science for about 3 years, and people thought, well, ExxonMobil is going to do something really good for the planet here, revealing what they've learned and telling the whole fossil fuel industry that they had to get off of fossil fuels. And no, the front office decided just the opposite, decided instead of telling the truth to start funding climate denial. And so now there are movements abreast to get the Department of Justice to have an investigation of a RICO case, which is what finally made the tobacco industries pay this a long time for a lot of money for this. Well, the woman who got that decision, now just today she came out saying that she's no longer with the DOJ, but she's encouraging the DOJ to do a RICO investigation of Exxon and some of the other companies. Yeah. So we may have a break here. But of course it'll take time.
Doesn't this conspiracy go way back to Standard Oil and even indeed back to Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse, J.P. Morgan? We're facing a 100-year conspiracy to cover up any kind of advancements in energy or in technology and combine the two. We're seeing a stifling of any innovation. We're seeing a stifling of any new marketable technologies. Do you think that this has been going on for over 100 years, and that's why it's so entrenched and so impossible to stop as a juggernaut?
Well, what's been going on for 100 years is about more general ecological damage from fossil fuels. But the world didn't really learn about the danger to the atmosphere and therefore to the climate until 30 to 40 years ago, in that period. And so it was in the 70s that the scientists started looking at it more seriously, and then ExxonMobil put in a lot of study about this. But then in the 90s, they reversed and decided, let's go with denial.
But isn't it so that companies like ExxonMobil, companies like Shell and BP, that they are just all tentacles of the one same octopus? That they might be different brands, they might be different corporations and companies, but these entities, at the end of the day, they're pretty much run by the one same single agenda. Is that not true?
Well, yes. We talk about it's the fossil fuel industry, and then that divides into the oil and the coal, and so they all have the same agenda, and they've all been engaged in climate denial. But some of the companies that some of the oil companies that had first joined with Exxon to engage in climate denial, they pulled out. They said, well, we know that's not true, and so we're not going to be involved. But Exxon just doubled down on it, and so started spending enormous sums of its own money.
In your book, Unprecedented, you point the finger at a lot of places, including the media cover-up, how they're not talking about all the wild weather being connected to this global climate change. But in my mind, well, you also mentioned the political will, how it's being bought out by the corporations. You mentioned the IPCC and the car manufacturers themselves. You mentioned them as all separate entities. I seem to figure that they are all playing the same game. It is just one loaded poker deck, that there is no chance to win because they're all playing the same agenda. Is that not hard to visualize?
Well, there's a sense in which that is true, and certainly it's money that's behind all of those different dimensions of it. And so I have a long chapter on the media. And I argued in the last chapter of my book is on mobilization. And so, although much of the book is, criticism and pessimistic, the last part of the chapter is suggesting some solutions. And one way would be if we would get an American president who would really lead a mobilization of the whole country and therefore indirectly the whole world with something like what we call Second World War type mobilization. And I argued in that chapter that the two most important entities in bringing that around would be the President of the United States. It would also be the Congress, if we had a Congress. And the other one is the media. And I see the media as the primary villain in terms of not doing its job. Its job is to educate the people. Its job is to respond to false public accusations, and it's done a little bit of this, but nothing like what should have been done and should be going on all the time.
Absolutely, and it seems to me that the corporate media these days certainly do not want to touch anything as divisive or as questioning that will get people thinking outside the box. They want people to just believe what they get told, believe the graphs and the nice shiny presentations, and go back to sleep. Nothing to see here, folks. That's part of the overall dumbing down of America and dumbing down of Western society. Would you not agree, Professor David Ray Griffin?
Well, yeah, and that's what I say. Money is behind it because the media, they like the advertisements. And, of course, Exxon and others are giving lots of money to the media, even PBS, for this. And they know if they started really hitting climate change, and so, for example, to take the thing you referred to, that if they would draw the evidence together that all of this strange weather we're having is due to global warming, and that is due to fossil fuels, they would lose their biggest accounts. And then they also fear that would cause another recession, and things would go down. And so there are all sorts of interconnected things going on, but basically related to money. And so they care more about their own bottom line than they do for the planet's bottom line.
A hypothetical situation here. If tomorrow we suddenly shut down all the oil refineries, shut down all the oil drilling, shut down all the petrol companies, if we shut down the entire oil industry tomorrow, hypothetically speaking, how long do you think it would take before we have an alternate technology that people could actually use? Do you think it would take at least a week of sheer cold turkey?
Well, it couldn't be done like that. It would have to be gone down somewhat gradually, say over a 10-year plan. That would be the most optimistic one, but more realistically, 15 or 20-year plan to get down to 100% clean energy. In my book, one part of the good news is that the clean energy is abundant. We have so much potential clean energy that we wouldn't need any fossil fuels whatsoever. And furthermore, the price has gone down dramatically. So right now, in many places, wind and solar is less expensive than either gas or oil or coal, even cheaper than coal. Now, when I say cheaper than coal, that means given the enormous subsidies that the fossil fuel industry receives every year. I have a long discussion of that in my book, just about how enormous the subsidies are by our own government. So, on the one hand, our government is saying, or part of our government, and on some days, Obama is saying we really need to deal with climate change. But then we continue to give the fossil fuel industries enormous subsidies, which make them seem to be cheaper. But
Absolutely.
If they had to pay the whole fare, including all the health care, say from coal, fossil fuels would be far more expensive than any kind of clean energy, and so they would go out of business very quickly. And so that's the main thing that we need to get done, is to get the subsidies dropped, and then the alternative is to put in a carbon tax. The best approach would be, whether it's a carbon tax or a carbon fee, but some sort of carbon price, and that will bring the use down very dramatically. And then, to get to your point, yes, the technology will develop so quickly. It's been pretty amazing in the last few years, the various kinds of technology that have developed and therefore been able to bring down the price. But if there were a price on carbon, then it would be just an enormous amount of innovation that would go on, and there'd be a lot of competition with this. And some people think that we could get down to 100% clean energy within 20 years. We could at least get very close. And the important thing is to get it done very quickly, because every year we wait, we have more horrible things going on and things that are irreversible, such as, glaciers coming down, which will destroy people's water, and so on.
I remember in my research of alternate technologies, I came across a guy, Stanley Myers, who in the early 90s came out with the water-powered car. He worked out a way to manufacture an electronic water splitter that basically was in place instead of the spark plug. And this thing injected hydrogen and oxygen into a normal engine and ran on, I think it was about 100 miles to a gallon of water. Now technologies like that, we have never seen them yet. Apparently, Stanley Myers did a deal giving the technology to the United States military and was killed shortly afterwards. But I do believe that these kinds of technologies have always been there. We've always had these things, but they've always been kept quiet from us. Do you not see that as a possibility, that we do have alternatives already and they're just not being shared with the greater public?
I don't know the details. I know stories about things where something that looked very promising was developed, and then the fossil fuel companies, and in some cases the rubber companies for the transportation, bought them out. They gave them an offer they couldn't refuse. And, we wish some of those people would have refused, again, if they would have taken the planet's climate bottom line more seriously than their own.
Thinking globally, do you think it's possible that Mars itself, the planet, is a representation of what's left after a planet gets raped of all its oil, gold, and gas?
I don't know any evidence for that. It's, given some of the
kind of
recent
planet
scientific...
we would see? We would see a planet like that if it was taken all of its carbohydrates out of the soil itself. That's the kind of shell we would be left with as a planet?
That is certainly correct. But whether that's what happened in the case of Mars, I don't see any evidence for that. So, but this is really above my pay grade, so it's not worth having me talk about that.
Sure. I understand. We do have a few questions from the audience, but we'll get to that after the half-hour break. Would it be fair to say that the kind of monopoly that they have over the planet, I'm talking about the major oil companies, the major chemical companies, the pharmaceutical companies, that these are all just tentacles of the one same octopus that's pulling the strings? Would you not say that's fair assessment of the situation?
Well, when you have an octopus, you have some sort of head, and I wouldn't think there's that much coordination going on. I think it's just people and organizations with similar motivations, generally greed.
Right. I noticed that through the book you quote numerously from Al Gore. Now, my perception of Al Gore, that he's a snake oil salesman, he's a polichicken, he's a Skull and Bones member. Can you define for me what credibility whatsoever Al Gore has to tell me about the weather, let alone climatic predictive models?
Well, actually, his film, although it was widely panned by climate deniers who tried to find errors in it, the scientists went back and looked it over and said almost all of it was accurate. In a few cases, there were errors, but nothing that affected the overall message.
So you're telling me that you believe a politician is telling the truth?
In this case, I do. I don't hold such a view that it would be impossible. For example, I'm now pretty interested in Bernie Sanders. I think with Bernie Sanders, we'd be much more likely to get the truth about a lot of things than we would with most of the other potential candidates.
Well, sir, I beg to differ. I see politicians as the one job where you know they're lying. It's when their mouth is moving. That seems to me that it's a prerequisite for the job. That you can't get into a job as a politician unless you're a professional liar. Don't you see that?
Well, I would rather talk about things I know something about, and that there might be some results from it. People can talk about these things all day and not achieve anything.
Well, I don't.
I do want to report one thing
Yes,
about my unprecedented. There is a NGO interested in human rights that's going to present my book to people at the big Paris meeting, which is the COP21, Conference of the Parties.
Wow.
And so whether anything will come from it, I don't know, but I am hopeful that my book might get presented to some people who could use it to be of service. I got some really great reviews of the book, and one person or group put it that my book was a great service to humanity. So I would hope that that might come through.
Well, it certainly is very, very important that we get across to the people how imperative this is, because it's one of the reasons I got into research myself, is looking to the future generations. What kind of a world are they going to inherit if this program, if this agenda is not brought to a stop? Don't you agree there, Professor David Ray Griffin?
Oh, absolutely, and I've written a lot about that, and I have a chapter on climate morality. And that is the main point, that our duty to future generations. And it's just, I can't understand how people who are in power, have the power to deal with this, don't do it. I mean, let's take Obama. He obviously loves his children. And I'm sure he wants them to be happy and have their own children be happy. Well, but his record on doing things with climate is very spotty. So he will do one good thing, and then he'll turn around and do something else that will undermine it. Bill McKibben, of course, has complained a lot about Obama on this. But even take the Koch brothers.
Yes.
You know, David Koch has children, fairly young, and you know, I present in the book this scenario that their children and then grandchildren see what Grandpa Koch did, and look back at him and just say, well, didn't you love us? Didn't you care anything about us that you destroyed our planet? So I don't understand that. Even if the greediest people, how they will do this in terms of their own family, their own children and grandchildren. But this would be to get into my field of theology and talking about original sin.
You know, sir, I was very, very impressed that you did make the analogy or the information on the Koch brothers available in your book. That I think that is one of the biggest underreported infiltrators of American politics that exists out there. That guy, those guys, and George Soros. These people have infiltrated the American political system, and not enough information gets out about these guys and what they're really up to, and indeed how they funded the Tea Party movement. That's something that was very, very interesting when I started reading that, and about how the Koch brothers influence all these other little umbrella groups that they have. They seem to seed their money into all these little groups that infiltrate the community at large and infiltrate society. Do you see them as a danger to our very way of life?
Well, they are, and thanks in large part now to our Supreme Court, which allows unlimited funding of candidates for, you know, the highest offices in the land, and but they have so much money. The Kochs, within 2 years, they increased their holdings from 40-some billion to up to 60-some billion. So they can spend tens and even hundreds of millions, which it looks like they're doing, hundreds of millions to fight any legislation against their interests. And those hundreds of millions, that's pocket change for them.
Yeah, it's chicken feed. Well, this is the People Who Speak radio show. I'm your host, Steve Johnson. We're talking with special guest, Professor David Ray Griffin, live on radio. And we'll be right back with our guest and audience questions after this short message break. Welcome back. You're listening to the People Who Speak radio show, coming to you live across America and across the world on International Internet Radio, bbsradio.com. I'm your host, Steve Johnson, and we're back tonight with our guest. He's a writer, an author, a researcher, and a professor. Without doubt, a prominent voice for 9/11 Truth. It's without any doubt of any pleasure, to have you back, Professor David Ray Griffin, sir.
Thank you, Steve.
Now, we have a question from Reggie in Maryland. Professor Griffin, do you think they lied to us about Osama bin Laden just as they lied to us about Jessica Lynch and Pat Tillman?
And I suppose there are two possible lies here. One is the lie of who was involved with the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and another is the possibility of lying about his death. Do you happen to know which question he was asking? Or
yes, sir. Specifically about the death of bin Laden, just about they lied at the death of Pat Tillman, the same sort of thing.
Yeah. That story, it's not something I've written about, so I don't have anything I can just go right down the points. But the story was so fishy. Paul Craig Roberts wrote quite a bit about that, and it seemed to me that he made a lot of really big points. I think the most obvious difficulty is the idea that they killed Osama bin Laden and then took him out and threw him in the ocean. So you would think, they would want to prove that was really Osama bin Laden, and they'd have DNA and everything. But no, you hide him, burying it on the floor of the ocean, and so there can be no research into who this really was. Well, that was just one of many, many difficulties. There was a new story that just came out today or yesterday about this, building on the work by Seymour Hersh.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think they're lying.
Okay, we have a question from Patty in Florida asking, heard you earlier mention a carbon tax. Is Professor David Ray Griffin suggesting a carbon tax is a good idea?
Yes, almost all economists, even very conservative economists, say if you really are serious about dealing with fossil fuel emissions, you need to put a price on carbon and make the price. You gradually raise it over a few years, give people a chance to make adjustments, and so within a few years, nobody will want to use fossil fuels. Now, this can either be a carbon tax, which obviously would go to the government, although they might use it for good causes, or James Hansen says, no, it shouldn't be a carbon tax. It should be a carbon fee. And that it would not affect the government one way or the other. So it wouldn't increase the size of government. That it would come actually back to the people. And so it may sound like magic, but on the one hand, you can bring down the use of fossil fuels, gas and coal and oil, dramatically, and yet it won't raise anybody's overall cost for transportation.
Well, sir, it's obvious to everybody, including blind Freddie in the corner, that as soon as you put a carbon tax on the amount of carbon that a company makes, it's obviously going to be paid for out of the pockets of the common person, out of the people who don't have that much to give. Wouldn't you prefer to call it a corporate tax on companies that make billions rather than millions? How about we start taking these billions of profit and putting them into new research and putting them into new areas, putting them into social welfare? Wouldn't that be better, a corporate tax rather than a carbon tax?
Well, that could be done too, but the carbon tax or the carbon fee, I actually prefer Hanson's idea here, and he's written quite a bit about this, so anybody could look online and find what he says. And no, it will not raise anybody's cost. And in fact, it might actually bring it down, so your total cost for electricity and transportation will be less than it is now. So no, it's actually not obvious, because there are lots of different plans that are built on taking account of that possibility and then ruling it out.
Right. Well, I'm calling you live and direct from Australia. Well, we did have the carbon tax, and I can tell you it did push up the basic price of everything. All the staples, all the food, all the transport, all the public transport, everything went up in price. It just killed off businesses. Small businesses were failing, and they're still failing today. It is such a bad idea because it does affect the people. And in fact, as far as I'm concerned, this is part of Agenda 21. This is part of the UN push. The IMF, the World Bank, they all have the same agenda, and that is to institute more taxes, more fees on the people to make life tougher. That's creating the criminal classes, and they're making a damn good industry out of that as well. You don't see that as being part of the bigger picture, Professor David Ray Griffin, sir?
No, I don't. I don't see it that way at all. And with regard to Australia, there's a good way to do a climate, a carbon tax or a carbon fee, and there are many, many dumb ways to do it. And I don't know the details, but maybe they did it one of the dumb ways.
Right. Well, that doesn't surprise me, considering we only get dumb people in politics. Seems to be the common way, I guess. We do have a question from Darrell in Northam, who asks you, in your opinion, is planet Earth just one big slave plantation?
Well, there is a lot of slavery now, and both in the, we like to talk about, well, we got rid of slavery by the end of the 19th century. But actually, there is so much slavery all over the world, and then, which is probably the point that was being made, that the kind of point that Bernie is making, that the profits of the rich keep going up and the profits of ordinary workers keep going down. And so in that sense, the rest of us are working for the 1%. And I hope Bernie gets in, and if he gets in, I hope there will be a way to deal with that.
Well, sir, I'm kind of pessimistic about this system, because we do have in the current president of the United States a guy who won a Nobel Prize for Peace and yet has killed more people from drones than anybody in history. And the guy in office today, the resident in charge of America, since coming into presidential office, campaigned to close Guantanamo Bay, and yet it's still open. Instead, He signed in the Indefinite Detention Act, the NDAA. Is this the kind of America that you'd hope for in 2015, Professor David Ray Griffin, sir?
Well, it's just like a carbon fee. There are smart ways to do it and dumb ways. And if you're the Nobel Peace Committee, one of the dumb ways to give a Nobel Prize is to give it to somebody who's never done anything yet. So, so yeah, that was just ridiculous all the way. And I know why. People suggest that they did it. They did it to encourage him, and so on. But that was a poor plan.
Who in your mind were the masterminds of 9/11? Was it Mossad? Was it Larry Silverstein, Dick Cheney, or all of the above? Was it PNAC? In your mind, who do you believe was some of the masterminds behind the 9/11 crime?
Yeah, well, there are different levels of masterminds. At the top are the people who thought of the whole thing and paid for it. And then at the operational level, the primary ones were Cheney and Rumsfeld. We don't know with Bush how much he was involved at the beginning. It looked like they deliberately kept him out of the way so he wouldn't screw things up, and gave Cheney a free hand. But if that was the case, then he clearly got on board very quickly and helped with the cover-up from then on.
Do you think George W. Bush, he was too brain dead to have played his role convincingly? That's why they got him to read a pet goat book in Florida?
Yeah, well, he clearly could not have been in charge of what was going on with the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. But Cheney, whatever you think about him, he's not stupid, and he had been the Secretary of the Defense corporate agency, and so he knew his way around very, very much, and of course knew all the ways. And then of course he knew the leading generals in charge at that time. So they had to do something. Even if George hadn't been brain dead, they still would have had to get him out of the way, because they needed Cheney had to be in ultimate control.
Absolutely. How much evidence have you seen of Israeli involvement in the 9/11 crime?
Yeah, that's a very much debated thing. I don't agree with those who think that Israel or Mossad organized it. Partly because, that's a dubious idea, because it suggests then that, well, we weren't really, our Pentagon wasn't really involved. It was the Israelis. So I don't think they had a leadership role. I do think they were all in favor of it. They clearly had people who knew what was going to happen, the artists and so on. And then it looked like I studied the so-called hijackers. Hijackers, because there was no hijacking. But the so-called hijackers. And it appeared that at least two of them were Israelis. So they were, I think, involved at that level.
Well, with guys like Paul Wolfowitz, a pro-Israeli, dual citizen Israeli in the Secretary of Defense and in that role in the Pentagon somehow, with him involved in the picture, and guys like Rabbi Dov Zakheim, the comptroller of the Pentagon, another one, a dual citizen Israeli who I believe is now working for Booz Allen Hamilton. With these kinds of people in key asset positions in the United States, David Frum, William Crystal, the whole project for the New American Century, with these kinds of pro-war neocon war hawks, is it no wonder that we suddenly get a war that's going to last for the next 100 years, and there's nothing we can do about it because they own everything? That these are the tentacles of the octopus. Do you not see that, Professor David Ray Griffin?
Yeah, I wrote quite a bit about the project for the New American Century. And, of course, I got the title of my book, The New Pearl Harbor, from them, because they were the ones that said we need
exactly
a new Pearl Harbor. And to the list that you just mentioned, I'll come back to one you mentioned earlier, which is Silverstein. And there seems little doubt that he was very centrally involved because it was, necessary to have the access to the building so all the explosives could be set. And, of course, he was highly motivated because of the asbestos that was going to cost him at least $1 billion to clean it up. And so for him, it was very much a win-win situation.
Absolutely. How important is it for critical thinking for people to engage in, do you think?
Well, there are many different ways that answer could go, but let me take the reference to my article. As far as I know, I'm the only one who's ever written an article about 9/11 and global warming. And for your readers, they can just look on the internet under that title, 9/11 and global warming. And my concern in writing that was that here we have this 9/11 truth movement, which I was a central part of for many, many years, and wrote 10 books on the subject and various other things. And the problem with regard to global warming is that it has that fact that that's what was done, that was false flag attack, has led many people to assume that anything that goes on is the government's fault, and particularly the U.S. government. And so they're suspicious then of any organization. So many people are suspicious of the UN, even though it has absolutely no power. They think the global warming, trying to stop global warming is a project of the American government. To the contrary, it's the project of the scientists for the IPCC, but the American government has been very reluctant to do anything, even under Obama. I mean, he's done more than anybody else. But under Bush, of course, absolutely nothing. And under Clinton and Gore, next to nothing. Of course, Gore was not in charge. Clinton was. And so they've bought this idea that there was an analogy between the 9/11 attacks and then the false story about those attacks, and then climate change. And it's actually just the opposite. Because with any of these things, you want to ask, who benefits from something like this?
That's
well,
right.
You look at 9/11, and it's very clear who benefited. And there were a whole bunch of things. We wanted to go to war, and Afghanistan and Iraq. We wanted the oil, and we wanted the military and the intelligence agencies to have an enormous increase in funding, and so on down. And
companies like Raytheon and Carlyle Group, they certainly benefited.
Oh, sure. I mean, almost everybody in that kind of business. And on the other hand, with global warming, so in other words, 9/11 is big government. But with global warming, it's big corporation. So it's not big government. The governments are not behind it. They're not getting anything from it. The idea that the scientists themselves are making this up in order to get grants. You're talking about chicken feed when we're talking about tens of millions of dollars, and various organizations, each getting a lot of money from ExxonMobil and so on. So this is clearly a case where the one who benefited is the fossil fuel industry. And so the real analogy is between the 9/11 truth movement, which argued that it was the government's responsibility, and then global warming, which had nothing to do with the government at all, and those who are arguing involved in this, they're pointing out that they are almost solely, the responsible characters.
Right. Final question there, Professor David Ray Griffin. Do you support the stop funding of Israel from American taxpayers?
Do I support what?
The stop funding of Israel by American taxpayers.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you very much for your time there, sir. It's been fantastic talking to you.
Thank you, Steve.
You've been listening to the People Speak radio show with special guest today, Professor David Ray Griffin. I'd like to thank him and remind all the listeners to check out his new book available on Amazon.com called Unprecedented: Can Civilization Survive the CO2 Crisis? Certainly a fantastic read and worth looking into about the dangers we face with modern climate change and global climate change that's affecting us all. Big thanks today go out to the producers Mike, Donald, and Doug, to all my friends throughout the world, to all the guys who give me so much support. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. You can tune into my own channel on YouTube called Stop Funding Israel. But for me for now, take care, and bye until next time. Hope you enjoyed this one just as much as I did.
It's a concern I've had for a very long time, and I had written a book that I never quite finished and therefore didn't get it published about 10 years earlier about various problems, and I decided that the climate problem was the number one issue. But then I got sort of sidetracked on 9/11, and I thought it was something I could deal with rather quickly. And but the motivation there was in large part, thinking that if we don't get 9/11 exposed, then the world is going to be so focused on terrorism and war that we will never be able to devote sufficient time, energy, and money to the climate issue. And so that was a long detour because I ended up writing 10 books on that subject. And but now I've decided I really need to get back. I was giving some lectures in China. I've been asked to give some lectures on climate change, and that really motivated me to see, how the Chinese are thinking about this. And of course, it is the fact that China and America are the two crucial ones, and if we can cooperate, we might have a chance.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, America. Whatever your time zone across this beautiful planet Earth of ours, you are tuned into the People Speak radio show this evening with Steve Johnson. The People Speak show normally airs every Tuesday, 6 to 7 p.m. Pacific and 9 to 10 p.m. Eastern on the BBS radio network. Anyone can participate during the show with call-in questions for our guests, toll-free in the USA and Canada on 1-888-429-5471. That number again, 1-888-429-5471. We have an amazing special guest on our show tonight. I'm more excited than ISIS getting their weekly CIA care package. It is a special guest, a professor of philosophy and religion and theology emeritus. He has published over 34 books, primarily in theology, philosophy, religion, with special emphasis on the problem of evil and the relation between science and religion. 7 of his books deal with 9/11, including the New Pearl Harbor, disturbing questions about the Bush administration, and of course the 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions. We are talking tonight to distinguished writer and researcher Professor David Ray Griffin about his new book called Unprecedented. Can civilization survive the CO2 crisis? And, of course, we're going to talk about the stooges that pulled off 9/11. Welcome, a big welcome to the People Speak radio show, Professor David Ray Griffin, sir.
Thank you, Steve. Good to talk to you.
Awesome to have you here, sir. We'll be taking audience questions after the first half hour, but my first question to you, Professor Griffin, sir, is what prompted you to write about global climate change in your new book?
Well, it's...
Yeah, in your new book called Unprecedented, you pull no punches. You go out after the ones who are really poisoning the planet. The big corporations will tell us that it's the people poisoning the planet, but really, at the end of the day, it is companies like ExxonMobil, it's companies like Monsanto, it's the major corporations that are earning the billions in profits that are really poisoning the earth. Would you not agree with that, sir?
Absolutely. The first, my book is divided into 3 sections. The first part deals with the various phenomena of climate change. Then the second part deals with the various problems, reasons we've had such many problems, media, politics, religious, and economics. But I started with climate denial. And the climate denial movement, is huge. And it has been funded by the fossil fuel industry, and primarily ExxonMobil for a long time. Now it's the Kochs putting in even more money than the ExxonMobil. But ExxonMobil was the one that got the really movement started. They put in many, many millions of dollars into it. They funded climate denial groups all over the planet. And, America is the primary one where there's denialism, but it's all over. The biggest story just recently is about ExxonMobil. And maybe you dealt with this on your program already. But a big study came out a few weeks ago showing that ExxonMobil, where it had been spending millions of dollars and claiming that there was no, truth to global warming being caused by fossil fuels, and there's no danger from climate change, from fossil fuels. Exxon, back when it was just Exxon, they did lots of studies on it, and they realized, their scientists realized that the fossil fuel industry had to change very radically, or they were probably going to change the planet so much it will not be reversible. Well, they did that science for about 3 years, and people thought, well, ExxonMobil is going to do something really good for the planet here, revealing what they've learned and telling the whole fossil fuel industry that they had to get off of fossil fuels. And no, the front office decided just the opposite, decided instead of telling the truth to start funding climate denial. And so now there are movements abreast to get the Department of Justice Justice to have an investigation of a RICO case, which is what finally made the tobacco industries pay this a long time for a lot of money for this. Well, the woman who got that decision, now just today she came out saying that she's no longer with the DOJ, but she's encouraging the DOJ to do a RICO investigation of Exxon and some of the other companies. Yeah. So we may have a break here. But of course it'll take time.
Doesn't this conspiracy go way back to Standard Oil and even indeed back to Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse, J.P. Morgan? We're facing a 100-year conspiracy to cover up any kind of advancements in energy or in technology and combine the two. We're seeing a stifling of any innovation. We're seeing a stifling of any new marketable technologies. Do you think that this has been going on for over 100 years, and that's why it's so entrenched and so